Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Dr. Luckin, and I'm the instructor for the Crime in America class. And you will discover that I'm going to be dropping a series of video lectures throughout the semester for each of the chapters. Um, some of um, some of the PowerPoints are pretty complete, and they reflect what's in the book. And by complete, I mean not complete as in providing detailed notes, but complete in terms of providing an outline. And others are add a little bit to the PowerPoint. Some of the PowerPoints have a little bit more added to them, and it includes maybe some information that is not in the text. That's another consideration. And then there are some that just the PowerPoints want a little bit more elaboration and a little bit more explanation. So for various reasons, I'll be providing a video lecture. But again, they'll be in various detail, these different lectures. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the first one. And let's see. So this is, let me zoom that out. Okay. So this is the overview of issues in criminological theory, and so this is chapter 1. And this is primarily addressing there's concepts that are relevant for understanding criminology, understanding theories of causes of crime, for understanding crime rates, crime statistics that you often hear, which are very frequently cited in the news and are really kind of becoming quite prominent right now as we hear about President Trump deploying National Guard and military personnel to different cities because of crime rates. And so the understanding of those crime rates are really important. Obviously, the implications are really serious when we think about the deployment of the military to certain cities or jurisdictions. So how we understand crime rates, what they mean, trends. You hear a lot of trends being discussed with regard to this policy. So this chapter is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of different things that set us up for a more in-depth discussion of the causes of crime. So go ahead and start with some basic terms. And again, I don't mean to sort of just read off the PowerPoint. That's not really my intention. Sometimes that's unavoidable. But my main intention here is to kind of just explain further and then just maybe highlight some issues that aren't mentioned in the text or are not mentioned with the same degree of depth. So basic terms, criminology, right? And that is nothing more than employing theory and the scientific method to the study of crime's causes and its control. A lot of people use the term criminology in a lot of different ways. Sometimes you hear on the news or you hear in TV shows, someone saying they're a criminologist, right? And typically, when they say that, they are not a criminologist in the way that we would define it in our field. They're a criminologist in the sense that maybe they're really more a forensic scientist, or they're a criminologist in that they just look at numbers. And they don't look at theories, they don't consider policy implications. So criminology is a term that can be used and sort of embraced by a lot of people. For our purposes, criminology refers to the study. It's a particular field of study, and it's a field of study that uses theory and the scientific method to try to understand the causes of crime and its control. So it is not about criminalistics. It is not forensic science. I know a lot of people are really intrigued by forensic science, but there's really no overlap, okay? Crime seems like a pretty simple term, concept to understand, an act or behavior that is statutorily defined as illegal, okay? A lot of times we think something should be a crime, or we talk about it as a crime, but it isn't. Okay, so there is kind of this basic requirement that it is defined in the statutes by law as illegal. And one of the things you'll C, as you're reading, is the difference between crime and deviance. And you sometimes hear those two terms used together, crime and deviance. Sometimes courses are titled that way. Sometimes textbooks are titled that way. And the reason why it's crime and deviance is because they're two different things. Deviance is something that is considered to be sort of a behavior that strays from the norm, or what is perceived to be the norm in society, but it is not deemed illegal. Okay, it's deemed deviant, or something that we consider to be outside the normal boundaries of acceptable conduct or usual conduct, but not being illegal. Criminality is, think of criminality as more of a trait, more of a sort of a characteristic, perhaps, of someone. And so criminality is looking at the differences across individuals and the propensity to commit crime. So the trait of criminality, one could, when you think about propensity can be low, propensity can be high. And so criminality is something that is ascribed to an individual. Okay, so we don't think of criminality in society. We don't say criminality in society. We might say criminality within a certain individual, within a certain population, but we wouldn't talk about it in terms of society, regions, cities. Okay, we would just say crime. All right, so why study crime, criminality, and human nature? A lot of people just kind of study it because it's curious. They're curious. They think it's an oddity. Most people tend to think of crime as an aberration, as something that is unusual, something that is not the norm, or something that shouldn't be or is not expected among people. And there's different views on that. But in terms of why we study it, apart from maybe just being curious, social order depends on it. Okay, so the whole reason why people started studying crime to begin with wasn't necessarily because people were just, oh, that's kind of curious. Why do people do that? They do it because it has implications for how we live. And um, and the degree of social order that we have. Okay, so social order depends on it, right? We can't have a very orderly society if people are constantly fearing for their lives, constantly fearing for their property, constantly fearing that, their home will be broken into, or if people are engaged in violence with one another rather than reconciling differences in other ways. So the entirety of social order really sort of depends on it. Effective governance depends on it. Laws depend on it. And the effective governance and the laws kind of go together. And there's a Latin phrase that you can see down here, the nature of laws found in the nature of man. And what that basically means is the reason why we want to understand why people commit crime, and then even more broadly, want to understand human nature, okay, is because our laws have to depend on it. Right? Laws are all about regulating behavior, right? And if we don't understand the essence of human nature, then our laws will be all wrong, okay? So most laws begin and are even written and drafted because there's a problem. Somebody or some group is doing something that some other group doesn't like, or is causing problems or disruption to the social order, communal living. And so in order to write a proper law, or a law, when I say proper law, a law that's going to be effective, you need to understand human nature. And if I think human nature is, I'll just say X, okay? And when I say I think human nature is X, if I say I think human nature is motivated by such and such, I think human nature is driven by such and such, then I want my law to take that such and such into account. I want the law to be written around that contingency. If I think that human behavior is motivated by this or that, okay, then I'm going to want my laws to reflect this and that, right? So the laws need to reflect human nature, because laws, that's why they exist, really, is to regulate human behavior and human conduct. So we would want to understand human behavior if we're going to write a law that's going to regulate human behavior. Okay, so some basic terms, moving along. Okay, so the problem of explanation, and much of this course will be focused on trying to explain crime. Okay, first of all, why coming up with explanations for criminal behavior are difficult. First, crime is the ambiguous concept. Crime is defined basically by certain people. Certain types of behaviors are deemed criminal or deemed crime, a crime. And so from that standpoint, it's an ambiguous concept. Okay, the fact that, say, something in one generation is considered deviant, okay, but in another generation is considered criminal, that in and of itself makes crime an ambiguous concept. Okay, so for example, there were certain behaviors in the 60s that were considered criminal, right? Most of you are familiar with the fact that there were laws against homosexuality, okay, or anything sort of akin to that, okay? Anything really, the easiest way to put it, anything that was non-heterosexual is criminal, okay? Today, not criminal, okay? So the way we understand crime can change because our definition of what constitutes criminal can also change, okay? Another problem with trying to accurately explain crime is the observation of criminal behavior and its measurement are inherently flawed. Obviously, we cannot see every act of criminal behavior at any given time, right? Criminal behavior is going on all the time undetected. So we can never really get a full picture of what kind of criminal behavior is going on, how prevalent that criminal behavior is, who is committing that criminal behavior. I'm sure you've all heard, sort of the black box of crime or the hidden nature of criminal behavior, okay? It is not all out there for everyone to see. And if it can't all be observed, then it can't be measured. And so we almost always are going to be starting off with a flawed understanding of how much crime there is and who's committing it. Therefore, we're going to have, our criminal theories are going to reflect that gap in sort of basic information. The problem of explanation, the normality of crime, okay? That kind of gets to the issue of, is there even a need to explain it, okay? Generally, we don't explain things necessarily that are normal. We try to explain things that are abnormal. And there is within the whole field of sort of theoretical criminology, is crime normal? Okay, and the case for crime being normal is that, well, crime exists in all societies, okay, always has. And it doesn't only exist in all societies, it exists throughout all time, okay? And so the idea that crime is something that is abnormal when it is so ubiquitous across all different cultures and societies, and it may look different and it may take different forms, but nevertheless, somebody is always deviating, so to speak, from what that society has deemed acceptable behavior. So crime is always there, right? The types of crime may not stay the same, but even if you had a society where nobody was committing index crimes, okay, our burglary, our theft, our sexual assaults, our murders, I hate to call it run-of-the-mill, but what we consider kind of our run-of-the-mill index crimes, even if you had a society that was entirely free of that kind of criminal behavior, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't still have crime. We might just define other things now as crime. So for example, we might say, well, gossip is criminal behavior now, okay? We're always going to sort of shift our standard, right? So, in colonial America, you did not have an overwhelming number, right? When people were coming here in the 1500s and the 1600s, I mean, criminal behavior in terms of, frequent burglaries and thefts and sexual assaults and homicide, I mean, those were really, really, really rare, okay? What was considered criminal behavior? Gossiping, not attending church on Sunday, kissing in public. There were all kinds of other things that we might consider indiscretions, maybe today, but for them, they were criminal behavior. So criminal behavior, you can have as much as you want or as little as you want, and it all comes down to how you define it. And how you define it kind of gets to the issue of, well, is this normal or not? How many people do this, right? Okay, so classifying theories. There are a lot of different ways to classify the theories of criminal behavior. The first one is, and these are, big broad categories, obviously. And the most broad, basic categorization is free will, okay, or sometimes we call it rational choice in more modern day language, versus determinism. And that is basically simply free will, and there's really only one kind of free will theory, rational choice free will theory. And those basically operate on the assumption that everybody has agency. Everyone, by what I mean by everyone having agency, that means everyone has autonomy and the capacity to choose their behavior, okay? And it is behavior that is freely willed, meaning your behavior, your choices are not determined by any external forces, okay? That you have full autonomy, okay? You're not being dictated, driven, structured, pushed, pulled, despite all kinds of other maybe extraneous circumstances. When it comes down to it, bottom line, everyone has the capacity to make decisions, right? And so free will would say our human nature is based on we seek pleasure, we seek the absence of pain, we seek benefit, we seek the absence of cost, and human nature really kind of comes down to that, right? It's a calculated decision, cost versus benefit, right? That we are almost economic actors, economic creatures, almost somewhat mechanical. We seek pleasure, we avoid pain, right? And that's about all there is, okay? So free will theories or rational choice theories basically whittle human behavior down to that calculus. And it's as simple as that, okay? Determinism is the opposite. And as the word would suggest, it holds that human behavior is determined by other things. So our human behavior is perhaps determined by our biology. Human behavior is determined by our social surroundings. Human behavior is determined by our economic predicaments. Human behavior is determined by our psychology, right? So it's basically saying there are many, many forces out there in the empirical world, whether they're psychological, biological, social, environmental, or some combination of the three, but that is what shapes our behavior, okay? Our behavior is determined by these other forces, okay? And so all of those different theories can be lumped under determinism. And as you can see, these two are very diametrically opposed, okay? One is free will. Again, rational choice would say, despite the biology, despite the environmental influences, despite your psychology, at the end of the day, you still have the capacity to choose, and that choosing is based on your desire for benefit, pleasure, and or the avoidance of cost and pain. Okay, by level of focus. Okay, so we have some theories that are very good at explaining individual criminal behavior, and some theories that are much better at explaining crime in society in general. Okay, so for example, and we'll be getting into some of these at the end, toward the end of the semester, conflict theories of crime, Marxist theories of crime are much better and are really aimed at explaining crime in societies, okay? Obviously, theories that deal with biology are going to be much more adept at explaining crime at the individual level, right? So for example, if I am taking a conflict or what we call a critical or a Marxist perspective, and I'm saying, crime is more prevalent in these types of societies. okay, as opposed to these types of societies. And you might look at aggregate crime rates, right? Maybe by country, and make comparisons based on the type of, whether they're capitalist, whether they're communist, whether they're socialist, whatever. And so the theory might hold really well on the aggregate level. Yeah, that seems to fit these types of countries with these types of governments and these types of sort of philosophies. There's a lot more crime. However, if I were to take that down to the individual level, I might grab a random sample of 200 people and maybe none of them are criminal. Okay. So some are much better at explaining things at the macro, aggregate, bird's eye level view, and others are much better and adept for explaining at the micro individual level. All right, so then the third categorization, and I've already alluded to a little bit, is criminal behavior or theories of criminal behavior based on how laws are made. Again, I alluded to some of this as I've been kind of moving through this particular PowerPoint. There's conflict critical Marxists. They all kind of, some of those you can kind of group together, and that they all share the assumption that crime is made, okay, by laws, okay, that we can have as much crime in a society as we want, and that the powerful institute certain laws to keep down or repress or pacify the poor or the rebellious, and that basically criminal behavior emerges out of that conflict between these power differentials and these different classes, okay? The consensus view basically argues, no, there are certain behaviors that are just criminal across the board. Most societies all consider them criminal. Again, some of our index crimes, sexual assault, homicide, burglary, robbery, right? And they would say, you could pretty much go to any country and they say, everyone's going to say, yep, those are criminal, okay? And so the idea of consensus is the idea that everyone is kind of on the same page when it comes to what crime is and what constitutes criminal behavior. And so that is what warrants explanation. The conflict simply says, yeah, but there's a whole lot of criminal behavior out there, things that are called criminal behavior that are really kind of created because of power struggles, okay? And struggles between the haves and the have-nots, okay? So two different perspectives on how laws are made, and how laws are made obviously affect what and how much is considered criminal. All right, so moving along. Characteristics of good theories. This isn't the most, fascinating, engaging topic, but nevertheless, something to be made aware of. So good theories, what makes for a good theory? And everybody's got their own theories on what causes crime, right? Everybody kind of thinks they're a criminologist. But in order for a theory to be what we would call good, it's a good theory, right? It's a solid theory. These are the characteristics, okay, that we would be looking for. The first is parsimony. And parsimony is a term that basically means the simplest explanation is probably the best, okay? Parsimony is kind of, the less complicated. Like if it becomes so complicated and you have to add all these contingencies, and by that, I mean, you could say, crime is caused by this, but if this happens, then this happens. But if that happens, then, okay, then that doesn't apply. Then that's not parsimony. If you have to have so many contingencies and pathways and what ifs and ifs, it's not good. Parsimony is keep it simple, right? And the simplest explanation is usually the best. Okay, scope refers to how much behavior can it explain. So if I have a theory of criminal behavior and it really only explains, say, sex offending, okay, well, maybe it's good at that, but it's not what you would consider a good theory overall because it doesn't explain very much. It only explains a very small piece. And we generally want our theories to be able to account for as much as possible. That makes it a good theory. Okay, and that means it has good general application. Okay, if I have a theory, again, that only explains a tiny portion of the behavior of a tiny portion of the population, not a good theory, right? Okay, logical consistency just kind of means what it says, right? That this is a theory that is coherent, that there are no inherent contradictions in it, that it just simply makes sense, okay? That it's not taking, again, kind of these contingencies where it makes sense on this level, but then you apply it to another situation and now it no longer applies or makes sense. So it needs to have logical consistency, okay? Testability simply means that your theory has to be capable of being tested, right? You can't have it so complicated, or it can't be so incredibly abstract or convoluted that you couldn't ever test it to see if it is accurate or not. And empirical validity simply means that it's proven to be valid, okay, through the gathering of data and observation and measurement, okay? All right, determining causality, okay? And this, you know, a lot of people toss the word cause around pretty casually. And to say that something X causes Y, there's a whole lot of conditions that have to be met before we can say a particular factor or variable causes another one, okay? And a lot of times life is just too complicated to be able to make that, okay, assessment that X causes Y. But in the event we try to do that, right? First, obviously, X must precede Y, okay? So causal ordering, sometimes again here we call it temporal ordering, but it's also causal ordering that is important. So let's just say, for example, and I'll just use some research I just did, right? So we established that there is a correlation, okay, between being married and having resilience, okay, the quality of resilience, kind of that perseverance and so forth, right? So there is, as this second line says, there's a correlation between those two variables, okay? But we can't say that being married causes resilience, okay? Why? Because the study didn't allow for the temporal ordering. The study gathered data at one moment in time, okay? So I can't say that the person who is married is more resilient simply because they're married. It could be that resilient people are more likely to get married. And maybe resilience causes more people to be married because they can tolerate the hardship of it. That was a ringing endorsement of marriage. Okay. So you can't say which one comes first. And in order to be able to say that X causes Y, you have to be able to establish that one of those variables is preceding, coming before the other. Okay. So basically, were it not for X, Y would not happen. Okay. So correlation and covariation does not establish causality. It simply means these two variables or these two factors move together, but we don't know which one is causing the other, right? So to use that example, marriage and resilience, okay, there's a correspondence between these two, right? The data is showing that people who are married, that correlates with people who also have resilience, but I don't know which one came first. Did the marriage create the resilience, or did the resilience lead to marriage? Okay, no spuriousness. What that word basically means is there's a lot of variables out there in the universe, right? So if you think of, think of a puzzle, okay, and a bunch of puzzle pieces are on a table. And one of those puzzle pieces, okay, you're saying, this one goes with this one, right? This one kind of causes, this one goes with this one, okay? But there's a whole lot of other puzzle pieces out there, and we don't know whether maybe one of those other puzzle pieces is what is really affecting that relationship, okay? So, for example, I might say, okay, I'll just go back to the same example. Being married makes you more resilient. And in my theory, that's my theory, And in testing that theory, I don't control for anything else. Okay. And the only variable I look at is, oh, marriage leads to resilience. But there might be a bunch of other factors that are impacting that relationship that aren't being accounted for. And maybe they're getting picked up in marriage. And I'm attributing it to marriage, but it's really something else. And I've missed it, right? It's what we call a spurious relationship. It's almost like you could call it, spurious is kind of a fancy word. You could say it's misleading. I'm thinking that it's marriage that's causing it, but it could be something else that's being captured in that marriage relationship that's really leading to the resilience. Okay, so the idea here is you have to control for all the other factors that might actually be controlling, contributing to that relationship. You don't want to miss, right? And think that X is causing Y when it could be that A, B, C, and D are affecting the X, and they may have a more powerful relationship to Y. Okay, so data sources. Okay, so this is kind of our little overview of some kind of concepts and some things to keep in mind. But the other thing is data sources. And the data sources are incredibly important because it's the data sources that inform our theories, right? Our theories develop because we look at data and we find patterns and trends. Our theories develop because maybe we just have a theory first. And we think, this is what I think causes crime. And then we go and we look at the data, and the data either supports it or it refutes it. Okay. But it's the data, okay, kind of going back here, that makes for the testability and the empirical validity. The data is an attempt to represent reality. Okay. And so if we don't know where the data is coming from, or we don't have good data that's trying to capture the reality, then the theory's bad, right? It's the old adage, junk in, junk out. So when we think about the theories, we want to think about the data upon which they're based. Okay. Or when we think about the testing of a theory, we want to think about the data upon which that is based. Okay. So if someone says, childhood abuse causes crime, okay, and the data that we look at to try to measure that is not very good, or doesn't really measure childhood abuse very well, or doesn't capture it in its totality, or as near as totality as we can hope for, then the theory may be completely invalid. Okay, so in short, we want to know what the data sources are and what the advantages and disadvantages or the problems with that data are. So obviously, when it comes to crime, one of our largest data sources and most common go-to data sources are UCR reports, Uniform Crime Reports. And maybe some of you have already become very familiar with this, maybe based on other classes that you've taken. But uniform crime reports are basically those things, if any of you have ever been a victim, okay, and the police come to your place of residence or wherever the incident took place, and then they start taking down information, right? That's a uniform crime report, right? So all of the information that law enforcement agencies collect throughout the country, okay, down from a city all the way up, right? Those are uniform crime reports. They are the reports on the incidents, 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 crime incidents that occur. And then it all filters up to the FBI, and they assimilate all of that data annually. And that is the UCR reports, okay? So that's what we mean by, with regard to this is our major information source. The information provided, okay? The information provided tends to focus on the offense committed, the time of day, the day of the week, and some basic information, right, of what happened, okay? Compared to some other data sources, they're not the most detailed, okay? But they do include what the offense was, how many victims there were, you know, again, what time of day, basically what gets filled out on that sheet, okay? Advantages, okay? The main advantages of UCR reports is that it is, what's the best way to put it? They've been around for a very long time, okay? So that's one advantage. And because they've been around for a very long time, the system and the data collection and the definitions and the processes and the protocol used behind the gathering of that information is pretty standardized, right? We've kind of got this down, right? Because it's been going on for decades and decades, right? Like since I think somewhere around the 1930s, okay? So the advantage is that it is a highly organized, highly established, developed system for gathering information on crime. Every jurisdiction, as they sort of forward that information upward to the federal government, they use the same rules in terms of how crime is recorded, what gets recorded. And so it's a system where the same rules are applying, right? So we're not getting, in Orlando, they're doing their own thing, right? And they just record whatever they want, or they record all of them, or what have you. And then over in, say, Tampa, they do what they want. There's some shared rules, if you will, shared standards that apply. So they all are going up sort of on the same playing field, right? Other advantages is because it has been around for so long, you can get decades and decades and decades of information, right? And you can look at trends that go back, from the 1940s to the 1950s to the present. So that is another advantage. It is very good for trend data. Even though it may not pick up, as we're going to find out, all the crime there is, you have a standard definition from year to year to decade to decade to decade. Okay, so there is some constancy in that. You have a good baseline. And so you can look at those trends. And because those trends are all based on the same definition and rules on reporting that crime, we at least know, okay, this is a common shared view, okay? So it's good for looking and analyzing trends, very good for looking and analyzing trends. And it's very easily accessible, as you will see. There's an FBI Uniform Crime Report website, right? So you can just go in, click, figure out what's going on in one county, what's going on in one city, what's going on in a region. And so there's a lot of information that is generated across the country. Disadvantages, okay? Obviously, the hugest disadvantage is if a victim never files a report, or you never call the police, and we know that happens a lot, never gets recorded, right? This is our hidden black box of criminal behavior. If your bike gets stolen, you may not record it. Okay, you're not going to call the police necessarily, especially let's just say you left your garage door open and then you go out and your bike is gone. Okay, that happened to me when I was, I don't know, 10th grade. I didn't call the police. Okay. Probably because I felt stupid because I left it over and then left the garage door open and went for a swim. Right. So we don't record everything. Had a hose stolen from me in graduate school. Right. Am I going to call the police and say someone stole my hose? No. Okay. And as we know, a lot of victims of sexual assault don't report. Okay. Child abuse does not necessarily get picked up and reported, right? Unless someone else sees it. So there's a lot of behavior that doesn't get seen, either because no one is reporting, no one is observing it, and or the victim just simply doesn't call it in. Okay, so all of that gets left out of the picture. Okay, factors determining whether police record an event. Okay. Generally, we think, well, they're supposed to record it every single time they come, right? And someone calls out. No, that is not the case. Okay. I can tell you on 3 occasions, right? Where One involved and I'll stop sharing for a moment, so you're not just constantly staring at PowerPoints. So I can tell you on 3 occasions, um, there was no police recording of the event. So one time I was um, in a driveway, and a person drove up in the driveway, asked for directions, and as I leaned over to the car to give the directions, noticed they were fully exposed. Okay. I called the police, okay, but they took no information down, okay? Even though I could have told them exactly what the person looked like, the kind of car they were driving, um, they took no information, okay? They just basically kind of actually they laughed, thought it was kind of funny, but they took no information down. Another time, um, uh, many years later, uh, someone peeping through the tiny little hole in the mini blinds. So you have mini blinds and you close them, and the area where the string goes through to connect, apparently that can have sort of a macroscopic effect when you look in. And so a person was caught doing it by a guy who was in training to be a police officer upstairs. And then 2 cops did come, and he chased the guy for like a couple miles. Um, and when they came to my apartment, never took any information. Okay. Another incident in Tallahassee. I mean, I can go on with these. Okay. A guy that was publicly exposing himself at a park in Tallahassee and was doing things. I was the only one that was noticing it. Because I went there a lot to study, and I called the police one time because now I had gotten to the point where he wouldn't leave the park, and I thought, okay, he's going to see exactly where I live because I just hop over the fence and there, you know. And so I called the police. I'm like, I can't really leave, can't go home. This guy's doing this. He's coming after me. He's, he comes up to my car. I mean, he's engaged in some really pretty threatening behavior. They didn't take any information down. Okay. So a lot of times they don't record the event. Okay. Even though they may come out on the call. Okay. They don't ask your name, nothing, right? So clearly it's not going to be recorded. So that's not going to get picked up. Again, if they think it's maybe something that's insignificant, or it's, some minor, situation, they may not record it. All right, so let me get back to our Zoom and our share. So, needless to say, that leaves a lot of crime information out. So, factors determining how police record the event. So what I just talked about before there was whether they even bother to. And then there's how they record it, okay? So without getting into too much detail, there's what's called sometimes defounding and unfounding, where the police come into a situation and you think, hey, this is battery, let's just say. And perhaps they don't think it is a battery, or they, what we call defound, which is sort of don't see it as serious, or diminish the seriousness or the severity or the classification of the offense, right? And so instead of maybe a battery, they might just, call it an assault or something, okay? So how they record the event also matters, okay? So instead of, something being maybe more serious, it gets recorded as something less serious, right? And as you can see, right, how police record an event, whether they record an event, very much affects what comes out here, right? So depending on different organizational variables, I mean, if there's a sort of an organizational policy in a particular police department that says, you know what, don't bother recording possession of marijuana paraphernalia, don't bother, okay, then that doesn't get picked up, okay. So sometimes organizational policies will affect what comes out in the uniform crime reports, okay. And I think, and again, I'm not speaking to the veracity of these things. I'm just using this as examples because it's kind of coming out in the news now. So one of the claims that is being made about Washington, D.C. and their crime rates and the reason why they're showing them as going down is presumably they're claiming, well, that all has to do with how they're recording the events and whether they're recording the events. Okay. So it's basically nothing more than, whether people make accusations of fudging the data, right? All right, so I'm just going to real quickly pop into the FBI Uniform Crime Report website so you can just kind of get an example of what we're talking about. And hopefully this comes up quickly. I don't know what all of this is. Okay, so kind of the fun of this, I suppose, if you want to call it fun, is you can explore, right? So you can go into maybe Data Explorer here, and you can look up anything, really. And this right here is in full view, the advantages, right? So you can look up aggravated assault, you can look at it for the whole United States, you can look at it by state, you can look at it by agency. Sometimes you can even, I'm not sure, I suppose if you go through this, you could look at things by small, like the police departments of less than 100, police departments of more than 100. And you can look at a time frame, right? Oops, and you can analyze it by age, right? And victim demographics. So there's really quite a lot here. You could spend quite a bit of time. Data discovery tool, again, queries that you want to look at, and then hit submit. Data Explorer, you can go by type, hate crime, expanded homicide, expanded property, etc. Law enforcement officers killed and assaulted. So it doesn't just report crime sort of against the public, but also crime against law enforcement. So you can see that there's other things that are collected here. Law enforcement suicide data collection. Okay, we're going to get now to this thing called NIBRS. And this is a new program, if you will. Got this here, NIBRS. Okay, and it stands for the National Incident-Based Reporting System. Let me expand this. Okay, and this is an attempt to improve upon the FBI uniform crime reports. And in some ways, they're almost kind of all rolled into one at this point. But basically, the impetus for creating sort of this new and improved system is that the information for the uniform crime reports, like we said, they have a lot of disadvantages. Okay, one of them being, for example, let's just say police arrive at a scene and there's a murder there, but also a burglary. Okay, they're only going to record the murder. Okay, so they only record the most serious offense for that incident. Okay, so the other things get left out. Okay, so that's one of the things NIBRS tries to correct. It's like, nope, we're going to put all of it down, not just the most serious crime at that particular incident. It also gathers a little bit more victim characteristics, victim statistics, more on offenders, so you can get a little fuller picture. It also expands the type of criminal activity that is included. So it isn't just the index 1 crimes or the index 2, it's expanded, okay? And the advantages are fairly simple, okay, right? It's still, it's a lot more information. It just paints a more detailed picture of what's going on than what uniform crime reports used to. The disadvantages, it's still based on whether somebody reports an offense. If they don't report the offense, then all of that information is basically out there in the universe and isn't being recorded as having happened. Okay, so in an attempt to correct our understanding of the incidence and prevalence of crime based only on what victims report or what gets reported. Okay. The National Crime Victimization Surveys came out in I think like 1972, don't quote me on that. And it's basically a way of trying to compensate for this problem, okay? Factors determining whether a victim files a report. So instead of waiting for the thing to be reported by police, this goes to the potential source, the victim. Okay, you will read in the text that this is based on what we call panel surveys. And so it is based on a random sample of households across the US. And over a period of, I think it's every 6 months, for a period of 3 years, the same individuals, households are interviewed, and the kind of information that is asked is extremely detailed. Okay, they want to make sure they forget nothing, miss nothing. Okay, so they do actually ask, have you ever had a hose stolen? Okay, they get down to detail. They ask, and they ask questions that try to prompt your memory. Okay, and partly that's why it gets so specific. So they include everything. Okay. It also gathers much more information on the victim. Obviously, it gets to the victim's age, it gets to the victim's gender, it gets to the victim's economic status, whether the victim is employed, the victim's education, the victim's race, age, ethnicity, religious affiliations. It gets to, also how many times someone has been victimized over that 3-year period. Okay, because they're interviewing the same people at different intervals. So, each time you interview them, you ask, and so you're capturing new victimization data. And what that new victimization data tells us, because you're going back to the same people every 6 months over 3 years, is whether certain people are repeat victims, right? How many times is someone victimized? And that gives us, again, a little bit of a picture. Are there certain types of individuals that are more prone to or vulnerable to repeat victimization? Okay. It tells you, it tells exactly where the crime occurred. And I don't just mean, oh, what happened at such and such an address. Were you in the house? Were you outside of the house? Was there anybody else in the house? So there's all kinds of variables that are being captured in this survey. The disadvantages and problems, okay? They're not perfect. They try to fill that black box, fill in that hole that emerges from just uniform crime reports. But some disadvantages include people's memory, okay? So sometimes, again, even though they're interviewing you every 6 months, they may simply forget. Okay, or they may get interviewed in the second 6-month period, and they may accidentally report something that happened in the first 6-month period as happening in the second 6-month period. Okay, so the memory can be affecting not only in terms of even remembering that it happened, but not remembering accurately when it happened. Okay. Or it could be some of the other disadvantages are one, it only interviews people in the household that are over the age of 12. Okay, so it's not picking up any information on crimes against anyone under the age of 12. And that's a big chunk. Okay. Some of the other problems, disadvantages, is it doesn't pick up on domestic violence very well. Okay, because particularly if the abuser is in the household, the person may be reluctant to say anything with them there. It also does not measure homicide, obviously, and it does not capture crime against individuals who are not in a particular household, right? So it doesn't pick up transients or the homeless or people who are just kind of moving in. Let's just say you were a tourist and you were victimized in a particular city. You're not going to get picked up. It's not going to get reported for that jurisdiction through a victimization survey for that jurisdiction. Okay. And let's just say they never reported it to the police. Okay. But particularly transients or individuals who are not housed, who are kind of constantly moving around, it doesn't pick that up very accurately. You can look for sample questions if it interests you. They're fairly long surveys. They take a while. I've never been surveyed. I often wonder, like, who's getting surveyed? I've never known anyone who's ever been surveyed, but obviously some people are. They used to be done in person. okay? And initially, one of the disadvantages was, maybe sort of surveyor bias, or maybe the person isn't comfortable with the person who's, administering the survey and asking the questions, and that could affect their answers. Today, there's just not really enough money to be flying around every 6 months over a period of 3 years to all of these random households. And so a lot of it is done either over the phone, and I suspect now probably online. And again, crime victimization survey data dashboard. So it's important when you look at crime rate data, okay, knowing what the source is. Okay, so there's crime rate data and there's crime rate trends and stuff that's based solely on victimization survey data. Okay, and then there's some that are solely based on uniform crime reports. Okay, so your graphics, if you go to quick graphics, and you look at violent victimizations, it's loading. Taking too long to load. Okay. So what's important to remember is you see here violent victimization, rate of violent victimization is 93 to 2023. If you were to just look at that, you might go, okay, that's the, but you need to understand that's not coming from uniform crime reports. Okay, that is coming from victimization surveys. Okay, and they look very different when they get compared. Okay, generally, crime victimization survey rates about crime victimization show there is more crime than UCR reports, okay? So it's important that you keep that in mind when you're looking. This is property victimizations, okay? Motor vehicle theft, everybody reports motor vehicle theft, right? So there's certain ones where there's just a really high correspondence between the UCR and the victimization surveys. And there's others where the correspondence between the two data, they're not very good. Okay, and again, it all depends on are these things that people tend to report or not report. And then again, this kind of gives you some extra information that is not necessarily picked up in UCR reports. The victim offender relationship may not be assimilated, weapon use, whether the person used victim services. So this really gets at information about the victim's behavior and the cost of the incident to them, the cost of the actual victimization, what was actually done to them in terms of injury. A lot of that stuff's just not picked up in UCR reports, okay? Whether they use victim services, that gets picked up, okay? So again, you can kind of get a sense here as you play through these two dashboards that they're picking up different information. Some being more detailed than the other. Okay, and the simplest self-report studies of crime as a data source, and this is really the most rare, but it tends to get used more in studies. Okay, so it's not something where there's a dashboard like this, or it's something that's assimilated regularly. Okay, obviously, national crime victimization surveys are administered regularly. UCR reports are compiled annually, right? So this is ongoing, constant data, okay, for which there's sort of standardized information. Self-report studies of crime are simply studies of crime that ask offenders, how often do you commit crime? Okay, so they might say, some study may say, hey, in the past year, and we already know they're an offender, let's say, they might ask, in the past year, how many offenses have you actually committed? Okay, maybe they weren't caught, okay, but maybe they committed 10 crimes and they weren't caught for any of them. Okay, so that gives us a little different picture. Okay, or it could be that you just take a random sample, and this happens a lot, where you follow individuals, say maybe from 15 years old up to 30 years old, and you routinely kind of go back and say, hey, did you commit any offenses during this time? So the idea here is you're going directly to the source, the offender or the potential offender. Okay, these are not, like I said, something where you can get systematic data on this, right? This just kind of helps us have a different picture of how prevalent crime is, how it speaks to criminality, okay? Like, do you have a particular offender? It tells us on average how many crimes, okay, does an offender commit, okay, before they get caught. It tells us whether offenders specialize, which they generally don't, right? So it may say, oh, you know, here they're committing a burglary, here they're doing some drug sales, here, oh, there's a sex offense, right? So it speaks to the types of crimes they're committing and the frequency, okay? All right, keeping on. All right, so this is, oops, let me go a little bigger here. So this is something that is not in your text, okay? And it's something I've added. So, and I do this because I think it's, obviously, I think it's important to just have it in there for the heck of it. And I think it's really important because, again, crime and crime rates are something that really get politicized. They're a very handy tool or a handy phenomenon that politicians like to use to get people riled up, right? It is something that is very, very politicized because everybody's concerned about crime, right? And certainly one of the things that has been found out is that you could almost survey people at any given time, at any given place. And if you ask them, do you think crime is going up or down? In overwhelming majority of the cases, people always perceive crime to be increasing, even when it's not even close to that. Okay, even when it's rapidly on the decline, they will still say, oh, the crime's increasing, crime's a problem. Right? People just think it is, right? And this is one of the things that is clearly going on with Washington, D.C. right now, right? So one side is claiming crime is out of control. We need to do something about Washington, D.C. It's not safe. And then you have the officials for the jurisdiction of Washington, D.C. saying, well, that's not true. Crime is not on the rise. It's gone down 26%. Violent crime has gone down 36%. You see the statistic, it's the lowest in 30 years. So you've got competing claims on the crime problem there, right? But people just tend to intuitively and naturally believe, oh, crime's going up, crime's a problem. And so it's really important, okay? I mean, like, who wants to go and live, you know, like, just believe a bunch of lies that get told, okay? So it's really important that you understand not only how statistics get generated, okay? Are they being generated by victimization surveys, okay? Are they being generated by UCR reports or NIBRs? And then knowing that, you can further analyze it by saying, yeah, okay, well, here's the problem with this data source. It doesn't include this, and it doesn't include that. And here's the advantage of this data source. It does include that. So this helps you analyze the truth, okay, or the veracity of a particular set of statistics, okay? All right, more so, okay, is understanding the difference between, and this gets really merged now in this very postmodern relativist culture, and it drives us social scientists bonkers. There is very clear differences between opinion, facts, and truth. And far too often, opinions just get lumped in as facts. I believe it, therefore it is, okay? Opinions are just that. They're opinions, they're viewpoints. They may have absolutely no basis in reality, okay? It can be just an ideology you have. It can just be your perception, but it may not be backed up by any facts at all, okay? A lot of people hold very strong and hard opinions about crime that have no basis in reality or fact, okay? Facts are data, okay? I can say, based on, say, crime victimization survey, I'm going to go back to this dashboard. I can say this would be a fact, okay? All right, I could say this is a fact that between 1993 and 2023, okay, the rate of violent victimizations has declined substantially. Okay, here's what is this? Let me get the numbers here. Okay, 22.5%. Okay, so excuse me, not percent. 22.5 people per 1,000 over the age of 12 have been victims of violence. Okay, back here, the rate was 79.8. That's okay, that's insane. That's a lot. 80 people per 1,000 back here in 1993. Those are facts. Okay, they are based on data, admittedly flawed data, but they are nevertheless facts. This is not an opinion. You can have an opinion about whether this is good or not. You can make a value judgment about it. And that's what an opinion is. It's a value judgment, but it may not be a fact. Okay, you may say, oh, well, I don't believe that. Okay, well, whatever. It's a fact. Okay. Now, let me get out of there. But it isn't truth. Okay, truth is the ultimate. Truth is almost, and I love the whole concept of truth. I go a little weird on that. Truth is something that is absolute, without error, right? Without flaw, right? It has an element of perfection. There is only one truth. There are not multiple truths, okay? Truth is singular by definition, okay? There are many facts. These generate facts. These generate facts. Uniform crime reports generate facts. Self-report studies generate facts. Do each of these give us the absolute perfect truth about crime? No, but they give us facts, and facts are better than opinions. Opinions are like, okay, you have that opinion, okay? Does it mean policies should be based on it? No. Okay, we want policies to be based on facts, but truth is really out there, right? And truth is really hard to establish. And by truth, I mean a completely inerrant, okay, without error, mistake, what have you. And that's a hard thing to establish, particularly when we're talking about crime, which is what takes us all the way back to here. The problem of explanation. Can we get the truth? No, but we can get facts, okay? Observation and measurement are always going to be flawed, okay? Unless we put a camera on everybody 24/7, right? Okay, so that is important to know. So in other words, even facts are socially constructed, right? And by saying they're socially constructed, and so yes, facts are not perfect. They're not perfect truth, but they are facts. But we also have to realize that facts are also socially constructed. How are they socially constructed? Right here. They're socially constructed. If the victim remembers poorly, then that's going to be reflected. That's a social construction, right? The truth is sort of being socially constructed. And so therefore it will be flawed, but it will still be, certain things will be facts, okay? This is socially constructed. Factors determining whether police record an event. That is social construction, okay? The fact about crime is socially constructed based on whether police record an event or how they record an event or whether the victim files a report, right? So there's social, organizational, political things that go into what data is there and available to give us our facts, okay? Okay. That does not mean that you just toss facts out because they're not perfect truth, right? They still give us accurate information. Crime is going down. You can look at the multiple sources, whether it's victimization surveys, whether it's UCR reports, and you can get an accurate picture. I mean, that's kind of it's going down, right? So we want to be, cognizant of the difference between these things, okay? The use and abuse of data, okay? that kind of goes into a little bit of what I was talking about. So for example, how statistics get presented. Okay, so a lot of times there's this thing called, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's in books a lot. It's called the crime clock, right? And you hear the thing, every 30 seconds, a burglary is being committed, right? Or every 10 minutes, and these aren't accurate numbers. I'm just kind of floating them out there as examples. Every 10 minutes, someone is sexually assaulted. And that's even high. Let's put that down to 5 minutes. Okay. When you look at that, okay, and it's a popular little statistic. It shows a little stopwatch, and it's called the little crime watch. And someone sort of whittles the information down in that way. Those aren't lies, they're facts, but they're presented in a way that make you go, oh my God, every 5 seconds there's a burglary. And when you hear that, okay, what are you going to think? Wow, I'll probably get burglarized if it's going on every 5 seconds. But when you stretch the data out differently and you analyze it differently, and let's say you analyze burglary rates per 100,000, it might only say, and again, I'm throwing around made up numbers, 200 people per 100,000. And that may be based on the same data that says every 5 seconds. So they're both facts, but how you present them creates a very different view and very different perception of crime and your likelihood of being victimized. So the crime clock, I'm walking around scared. Oh my God, every 5 seconds, right? 200 out of every 100,000. Oh, I'm good. That's hardly anybody. Okay. So that also matters, how we present the data. All right. And these two concepts here, fear of crime and risk of crime, okay? This fear of crime tends to very much shape people's opinions, okay? Fear of crime simply means you are afraid of becoming a crime victim. You may be on the lowest possible scale of becoming a crime victim, but if you are fearful of it, then in your mind, it's real. And that tends to translate to, oh yes, crime's going up. Oh yes, crime's a problem. Not because it is, because you're just afraid of it, okay? So that very much is what shapes opinions, people's fear of crime, okay? And people's fear varies by their social demographic characteristics. So somebody based on age, based on race, based on economic condition, based on where they live, okay? Different kinds of variables like that are going to affect a person's fear level, vulnerability, okay? If I'm very elderly, okay, maybe if I'm, 80, I'm in a walker, or perhaps if I'm disabled in some way, or I have, or if I'm blind or something, I'm more vulnerable. And so I may fear crime more, which then may translate again to the notion that, yeah, crime's a problem because you fear it, okay? Vicarious victimization is also something that affects people's fear of crime, okay? And again, why do we care about fear of crime? Because people get asked about this in surveys when people are running for office, right? Or different political parties are polling individuals, and they ask you, I don't know if you've ever filled them out, but they will ask you, what are your most important issues in this race, right? Or what are your most important issues as a Democrat or as a Republican? And they might list school, education, high cost of living, war abroad, crime, right? If you are fearful of crime, then you're going to be checking crime all the time, right? And you're going to think that's a problem. And then now policies are going to go, oh, wow, look at all these people. They're afraid of crime. We better tap into that, okay? But it's just your fear, and it's not a reality. Vicarious victimization is you hear about other people that have been victimized, or someone that has been victimized. And certainly a great generator of vicarious victimization is the local news. I hate the local news. There it is on record. I never watch it because it is nothing but one crime report after the other. I think they just sit by the fax machine or whatever they're using these days, and they're just getting the reports from local police and they're just reading it. Like, here's our local news. Like, it's just lazy, right? And so people watch the local news and it's just one criminal event being talked about after another. And you're going to go, oh my gosh, crime is a problem. It's everywhere. Oh my gosh, somebody in the neighborhood. I'm now getting on my emails these things called neighborhood alerts. I have no idea how I got it. I don't even remember signing up for it. And on these neighborhood alerts, I'm being told 0.5 miles away from you, there was a domestic incident. In an area 0.7 miles from you, someone shot someone. And if I keep looking at all of these alerts, okay, I'm going to think that crime is going up. And oh my gosh, I'm likely to get affected. When one is a domestic violence situation, probably clearly, and the other, it wasn't just some random guy that went, I'm going to kill somebody. Okay, there was obviously maybe a drug deal or something like that. But the point is we get all of this information and it's going to affect our view of crime. It's vicarious. It hasn't happened to us, but we heard about someone or we know someone. And so we tend to think crime is more serious than it is. So that's what vicarious victimization is. Values, again, I kind of went to that. If you have, I don't know, very particular views on criminals and crime, and it's the, it's the bane of our existence, and society is going downhill, and civilization is in ruin, right? And you just think chaos is ensuing and there's crime everywhere, right? And here's another, right, example of fear of crime, okay? And using fear of crime as a political tool. Immigrants are predators. Immigrants are this, immigrants are that. And then when you look at the data, it doesn't hold up, right? But maybe you believe, okay, your value is, well, I don't care whether it's up or down. If you're, here, you should abide by the laws. Someone may think, oh, it's a privilege that you get to be here, so you should be perfectly law-abiding. Okay, if you hold that view, then your fear may vary and you may think, well, they're committing all the crime. I'm hearing this and they shouldn't be. And okay. So your view on that particular issue maybe makes you more susceptible to believing that crime by immigrants is high, increasing, what have you, okay? So these are some of the variables that affect our fear, and our fear affects our perception and our opinions. And as we get polled, or as people vote, or as things get used to get us riled up or to get us fearful, right? People use crime statistics to make us fearful for a reason, okay? Whether they're true or not, okay, or accurate, or they're presented in a way like the crime clock that makes us fearful, okay? Risk is the actual statistical odds of you becoming a victim, okay? Fear is your perception, your worry, okay? Risk is your statistical odds, okay? And I'll give you an example. There was a gentleman I knew who, older white male, 60, doctor, wealthy, lived in a gated community with high walls in the back with video surveillance and all kinds of security measures in the house and around the property. Okay. Constantly fearful of crime, shutting the blinds around 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock when it starts getting dark, so nobody can see in. Every time going out in the car, has a gun in the vehicle. Anywhere you go, if there's anybody there that's kind of looks a little sketchy, of a different race or ethnicity, fear, poof, erupts. Okay, lock the doors, right? And communicating to this individual the facts. Okay, I said, you are and this person was just so fearful of being a crime victim. Okay, a lot of it based on values, a lot of it based on, you know, and not even vulnerability necessarily. I would say most of it values. And I would say, you are so unlikely to be victimized. You fit in the lowest category, okay, of people victimized. And let's not even forget the fact that you're living, whether in a neighborhood where there's a security guard, there's gates, there's high walls, and you're already in the back. You've got video cameras around the house. And I would say, gosh, I teach this. Let me show you the data. You don't need to be having fear. Okay. Had no impact whatsoever. Okay. The fear was not going to get dislodged by the facts. Okay. So there are risks of your statistical, factual data odds of becoming a victim. And then there is fear. And fear can unfortunately sometimes very much override even knowledge and facts presented to us. All right, and we're getting towards the end. Yeah, okay, just a couple more. Hang with me. Okay, so these are just some of the things that I was telling you about how statistics get presented. Okay, do they get presented as a rate? Okay, percentages are rates, ratios are rates. But basically what the kind of getting down to the nitty gritty, what a crime rate does is it doesn't just give us information about crime, it standardizes. So you can make comparisons year to year, population to population, right? So when people will say, let's just say, for example, oh my gosh, there were 10, again, made up numbers, there were 10,000 burglaries in Tampa last year, and there were, let's say, 12,000 in Orlando. Okay. So people will say, oh, well, Orlando, and this is not, I should reverse my example. There were 12,000 burglaries in Tampa and 10,000 in Orlando, right? So someone might have said, wow, Tampa has more burglaries than Orlando. Well, when you just count the raw numbers, you can't do that because Tampa is considerably larger than Orlando, right? They have almost 3 million, their sort of metro area versus our metro area of 2.1. Okay, so when you take the population into account, which allows you to standardize, create sort of equality between the two cities, because now you're taking the population into account, you find really that we have more burglaries, right? Okay, because you're doing it per 100, you're basing it on the population, and this standardizes things by you divide the number of crimes, okay, is divided by the population, and then you multiply it times the base that you want to use per 100,000 or 1,000, okay? And that gives you your rate. And so you can make comparisons across jurisdictions that have very different population sizes, okay? And the same thing from year to year, okay? So incidence of crime is the number of criminals divided by the number of crimes. Okay, so we may have a situation where they go, oh my gosh, there's 12,000 burglaries, right? In Tampa, that doesn't mean there's 12,000 burglars, right? It could mean that there's only 100, right? So we could say, oh yeah, there's a lot of burglaries, but we can't say there's a lot of burglars, right? And so what this does is it tells us, is it a small number of individuals that are committing the bulk of this crime, or do we actually have a burglary problem on our hands in terms of, wow, there's a lot of people becoming burglars these days, okay? And so that gives us that difference, right? Is it a small number of individuals or a certain number of individuals, or is it a large number of individuals, okay? In other words, how many people are really responsible for this quote unquote crime problem, okay? So obviously, if there's 10 people that are committing the majority of the offenses, take out those 10 people and your crime rate goes down quite a bit, right? So that's what this information gives us. And then crime trends are pretty simple. Crime rates over a set period of time, okay? When you want to talk about a trend, you really should be going over 3 years, right? because anything within the 3-year period, it could be a blip, it could be an aberration. So someone doesn't want to say, well, the trend in crime is that it's going down since 2023. Well, okay, that's not very long. You want to stretch your time frame out a little bit more to get a real sense of whether something's just a blip on the screen, an aberration. Okay, you want to establish a little bit broader view, longer view. All right, and then this again is pretty self-explanatory, so there's really no need for me to read this off. These are again just different terms, how crime is distributed across the population. And this is nothing more than there are certain people who are going to be victimized more than others. There are certain groups that are more victimized than others. Crime is not equal across gender, age, race, household income, marital status, where you live, victim offender relationships, or time of day and place. Crime varies according to these variables. Victimization varies according to these variables. That is simply called differential risk. Okay, so there is this thing I'm calling here risk of crime, your statistical odds of being a victim, but this risk, okay, is further conditioned by, shaped by, determined by, pick your word, these things. Okay, crime, victimization is not evenly distributed across the population. There are certain ages and groups that are victimized more frequently than others. So there is risk, there is the reality of your statistical likelihood. In your statistical likelihood, there is differential risk. Okay. And then there's cumulative risk, which is your chances of being a crime victim over a lifetime. Okay, so perhaps your likelihood, again, your risk of being a crime victim in a year, in a period of a year, or even 5 years is really low. But stretch that out to 25 years, and now it's going to change. Okay, so maybe some of you, although you should be, because all of you are in a demographic in terms of age that makes you more at risk of being a crime victim. But let's just say by some sheer luck, you've made it to 20, 21, 22, 19, and you haven't been one. I can pretty much say, well, just wait a little while. Okay, over your lifetime, something will happen. You'll get burglarized, something will happen. Okay, I'm not saying it's going to be bad, but something will. Okay. So people's risk over a lifetime, it's called cumulative risk. Some people, again, have a higher cumulative risk than others. Okay. But it's just the idea of over a lifetime. Okay. Comparative risk is your likelihood of being a crime victim versus something else. Okay, so we hear a lot of times whenever there's plane crashes, right? People say, oh, well, you know, you're much more likely to get in a car crash than you are a plane crash. Okay, true. Okay, that's a comparative risk. Okay, it's not a good comparison in my mind, because if you're in a plane, you're going to die. You're in a car, maybe not so much. Okay, the comparative risk is you're taking two different types of incidences and making comparisons. So your chances of being a crime victim versus some other tragedy, your chances of being a crime victim versus an accident, getting in a car accident, or your chances of being a crime victim versus getting cancer, or your chances of being a crime victim versus getting, you know, having to go to the emergency room. Okay, take your pick, right? That's comparative risk. Okay, so differential risk, comparative risk, two different things. Don't get them confused. All right, so now we're at the end. So you do need to consult the Pew Research, and it just makes it a little easier. Obviously, you can get all of this information off those dashboards that I showed you earlier, but that kind of requires that you start entering in all the information, and it can get real detailed. These just kind of give you some real quick snapshots, okay, of what the data says about crime in the US. So take a look at this, look at it more in the aggregate, okay? This also gives us some crime trends in the US based on a sample of cities. And then this is kind of a new thing that's come out, real-time crime index. What that is generally, and I'm gonna get out here. Generally, to get crime rates and to understand what crime is, you kind of have to wait to the end of the year, right? When they compile their reports, and certainly uniform crime reports are that way. National crime victimization surveys are that way. So there's always a lag, right, of a year and sometimes maybe more. Okay. Real-time crime index is giving you up to the minute information on crime that occurs. Okay. So different way of sort of getting your sense of the incidence of crime that is going on. But take a look at particularly the Pew research, because it gives a nice clear snapshot of the prevalence of crime and crime trends and so forth that you're going to want to know. So, so that takes us out of that first module, and going to the back again. Oops. All right, all the way up to the front here. So that was chapter 1, okay, in the book, The Essentials of Criminology. So that was our basic overview. And I'll stop sharing. And so I will see you again in chapter 2. And have a good rest of your day.